Chapter 31, Monterey County. In June 2001, NF member Ben Wedo Chavez paroled with directors from Conejo to meet up with Bubba in Salinas and to begin re-establishing the regiment in San Francisco. Wedo ended up getting out, only to never be heard from again. He had completely disappeared and never followed through with any of the directives he was given. More than likely, Wedo decided to turn his back on the NF for whatever reason, and it's safe to assume that he may even have handed his directives over to law enforcement. Prior to my approaching parole date, a month after Wedo was released, I got a visit from the same unit counselor in July, advising me that my parole plans had been changed again. I was no longer going to be allowed to parole back to Mendocino County. This time, he told me I was being transferred to Monterey County, which I assumed was for no other reason than to set me up. Salinas was a hotbed for NF indictments at the time, and there was still a lot of drama unfolding out there. Now I was being thrown from the frying pan directly into the fire. More than anything, I was pissed they were jacking me around like this. Moving to Mendocino County was hard enough, but now that I had established myself out there and was making it, they wanted to snatch the rug up from under my feet once again and force me to do it all over. And of all places, why Salinas? Armando Suave Heredia, Roque Boxer Martinez, Martin Stalker Ramirez, Armando Tizoc Frias, and others had just been indicted in a murder that took place in one of Chinatown's bars called Cap Saloon. The victim was an individual named Raymond Sanchez, who became embroiled in a power struggle with the regiment. Sanchez, who was a known dropout, began competing for the heroin trade in Chinatown and had refused to pay taxes after being warned by a young C named Martin Stalker Ramirez. Stalker had already threatened Sanchez and had even chased him out of Chinatown on one occasion. But now, Stalker had taken the issue up with the overall street administrator, Daniel Lizard Hernandez. Unbeknownst to Stalker, Lizard had become an FBI informant in the latter part of 2000 and was working covertly with the FBI to take down several NF regiments across Northern California. Stalker also confided to Lizard that Suave, who was the regimental commander, the RC, wanted to go to war with Sanchez and insisted that they needed to flush this guy out. This was where the Operation Black Widow investigation became a controversial topic. According to transcripts and courtroom documents, Lizard initially followed the instructions of his FBI handlers by pushing for a peaceful resolution and discouraging any acts of violence in situations like this. But as Stalker persistently continued to push the issue, Lizard slightly conceded, leaving the option aimlessly open. Lizard told Stalker there shouldn't be no bloodshed, but added, if something comes at us, then you can't help it. Just don't go looking for it and doing anything. Stalker told him, it's in motion. We're going to take care of it tonight. Lizard responded, yeah. The following day, a regimental member by the name of Armando Tizoc Frias was at Cap Saloon shooting pool when he recognized Sanchez sitting at the bar. Tizoc was an aspiring young norteño who knew that taking someone out like Sanchez was his meal ticket. Tizoc called Roque Boxer Martinez from a payphone and told him that Sanchez was at the bar. Boxer said he'd bring a .22 and told Tizoc to meet him outside in the parking lot. When Boxer arrived with the .22, Tizoc tucked the weapon into his waistband, went back into the bar, and without any show of mercy, he walked up behind Sanchez and fired a bullet into the base of his skull. Sanchez died within minutes. One of Sanchez's companions, Joe Criminal Cantu, who was at the bar drinking with him, was also shot in the neck but survived his injuries. He stumbled outside and collapsed in the alley next door to the bar where the paramedics would later find him. When one of the defense attorneys, Mark Silversmith, later argued the case, he would accuse Lizard and his FBI handlers of being culpable in the death of Sanchez. Silversmith said, there's blood on the government's hands. They sat by and watched these guys pick each other off one by one. Silversmith went on to say that the feds were preoccupied with preserving their investigation instead of saving lives. Aside from this case, there was still a lot of fallout from Operation Black Widow that I tried not to get caught up in. By this time, Robert Chico Rose had also become a casualty of Lizard's agenda. Sometime in April 2011, Lizard was contacted by an individual named George Tafoya, who resided in Stockton, and asked if he could acquire 2 pounds of methamphetamine for him. Lizard then contacted Chico and subsequently asked if he could provide 2 pounds. Lizard drove to Chico's house on Topeka in San Jose and picked up the dope, before driving back to Stockton and delivering it to Tafoya. Unbeknownst to Chico, he had just fallen in the Lizard's trap, as Lizard went back to his FBI handlers, Special Agent Natalie Fallon and Special Agent Amy Fallon, and Special Agent Sean Reagan, and provided them with the details of this information. Chico was later arrested and also indicted in the Black Widow investigation. As soon as the counselor told me about my new parole plans, I let Mateo know where I was headed and asked if he had resources or contact information for the other brothers out there. He gave me his mom's number and address, and he said he would put me in touch with his sister, Sophie. He also gave me an address to a homeboy by the name of Bobby, who he said would help me with anything I needed. Even though I knew Sophie had gotten caught up in the Cap Saloon case, she was out on bail and had her own house with an extra bedroom. I really had no intentions of staying at her house, but knew she could probably put me in touch with the other C's at the very least. Mateo told me that Bubba, Wino, and possibly even Smokey should be out. He didn't have their addresses, but he said Smokey's house should be easy to find, as he lived on the corner of Sanborn and East Market Streets. Within 2 weeks of my scheduled parole date, I was transferred to Salinas Valley State Prison due to my high control parole status. I stayed there in a bulldog-infested building until a parole supervisor by the name of Bordoff came out to pick me up. I signed my parole papers and dressed out in my parole clothes. Then we got in the Bordoff's parole vehicle, drove out of the prison, and jumped on the freeway. Bordoff was a parole supervisor with a lot of experience. He had dealt with a lot of NF members over the years. He was assigned to a special caseload as a new supervisor who oversaw all the validated gang members who were mostly NF and NR members. Coincidentally, I had heard his name mentioned in the past from Boxer and Bubba, as he had also been their parole officer before he became a supervisor. My first conversation with Bordoff was completely different from the one I had with Supervisor Jerry Cardoza from Ukiah. Bordoff told me straight out, "I know all about your history. I know who all your boys are out here, and I'm just going to give you fair warning. If you want to walk down that road and get yourself involved with the fellas out here, that's your business. But don't let me hear about it. If I see it or hear about it, I'm not going to play games with you. I'm going to send you straight back." When we got to the parole office, we went through all the routine motions of taking my pictures, signing parole papers, and going over my conditions. My parole agent ended up being another guy by the name of Tim Wirt, who I wouldn't meet until a couple days later. Tim had just as much experience as Bordoff. While Bordoff was taking my pictures, he started up again about me getting in the mix and involving myself with the regiment. There was really nothing I could say about it. I completely avoided everything he said about the regiment and instead tried to change the subject by asking him where I would be staying. He said he put me up at the Rodeo Inn on Main Street for a week. After that, he would try to get me into a new halfway house that was opening up in the marina. After we went by the hotel and I dropped off my parole box, we drove around Salinas so he could show me where all the stores were at and how to get back to the parole office from where I'd be staying. When he pulled up in front of the Walmart on the other side of Main Street, I told him to drop me off and I walked back to the hotel from there. Before he drove off, he told me to stop by the parole office that following Monday to touch base with Tim Wirt, and then he left. The first thing I did was call Melissa and my mom to let them both know I was out. Things had gotten a little distant between me and Melissa, but she still had all my clothes and a lot of my things. For this purpose alone, I wanted to keep things good between us, at least until I was able to get everything back. When I got off the phone, I noticed a youngster who looked like a little homeboy standing in front of Walmart smoking a cigarette. He was wearing a Walmart uniform, but I noticed a tattoo on his neck that said SEM. I knew it stood for Salinas East Marqueta, as this was the same neighborhood Smokey and Boxer were from. I approached him and introduced myself. I told him that I had just paroled from the Bay and was trying to get in touch with some of the homeboys out there, but had no way of getting at them. I told him I had the address, but I didn't know my way around. He got on his cell phone and called another homeboy. He said he could probably get to drive me out to that address. When this other homeboy pulled up about 15 minutes later, the first place we went to was Mateo's mom's on the east side. When I knocked on the door, a young girl answered and said that Mateo's mom, Maria, wasn't home and Sophia didn't live there. I left my hotel phone and room number with her and asked her to have Sophie call me whenever she came by. The next address was to the homeboy Bobby that he told me about. When I knocked on the door, an older lady answered and said that Bobby and his wife, Monica, had just moved out a week earlier and she didn't know where they lived. The last place we went to was at the corner of Sanborn and East Market to find Smokey's house. There was only one house on the corner next to a liquor store, and I figured this had to be it. As soon as I walked up the walkway leading to the front door, I noticed somebody finger painted Rodriguez's residence in the concrete. I was at the right place. When I knocked on the door and asked for Smokey, a young girl answered, but said he was back in jail. That was the last address I had and wasn't able to get a hold of anybody. Now I was out of options, so I went back to the hotel. When I got back, I jumped on the payphone located outside the lobby and tried to call Melissa again. As I stood there talking on the phone, a carload of homeboys pulled up, got out, and went into the liquor store. When they came back out, one approached me after seeing the Nuestra Familia I had tattooed across the back of my head and introduced himself. After we started talking, I asked him if he knew Bubba, Wino, or Boxer, or anyone else who might have been out there that was plugged into the regiment. He knew Wino and said he could probably get in touch with them. That was the break I needed. I ended up driving to a house with them where he said he'd call Wino and have him meet us out there. We ended up spending the next couple hours drinking until he finally managed to get Wino on the phone. When I got on the phone, Wino was just as shocked as I was that they actually paroled me to Salinas and that I was really out there. Wino and his girlfriend Veronica, who they call Ika, swung by and picked me up about 20 minutes later. We went to Red Lobster's for dinner and then they dropped me back off at the hotel. It was already late, so we made plans to hook up the next day after Wino got off work. Right before they left, Wino gave me his number and Sophie's numbers. However, he warned me that it might be in my best interest to keep my distance from Sophie since she was still hot behind the Cap Saloon incident that she had gotten caught up in. Moreover, he said that she might be in hot water as her and her sister Lisa were both identified as targets in the Operation Black Widow investigation. He added that they were already in the process of trying to get clarification on it and would let me know as soon as he heard something. When I got back to my room that night, I took a shower and crashed out. Early the next morning, I called Sophie and managed to get her on the phone. I explained that I just paroled from the Bay and her brother Mateo told me to get in touch with her. She said her mom gave her my number and told her I came by the house, but due to everything that was going on, she didn't call me because she didn't know who I was or what my intentions were. Sophie said she was in the area and asked if it was okay to come by because she'd rather not talk on the phone. She was obviously still shook up about the case that she was involved in. I told her I'd be outside in front of the hotel waiting for her. She pulled up about 20 minutes later in a small truck and picked me up. We drove around Salinas talking, mostly asking her questions about Mateo, who she hadn't seen since he'd been convicted and given life. We also talked a little bit about her case and how she got caught up. She said the feds hit her house and tried to get her to cooperate. She said they had also placed a listening device in the truck we were in and destroyed the dashboard when they pulled it out. I noticed it, but just assumed somebody had ripped her stereo system out. Knowing that I was sitting in the truck that the feds placed a listening device in made me a little uneasy, but we weren't really discussing anything of importance. Something else I noticed was that Sophie held a lot of resentment towards Smiley and Lobo after they had gotten arrested for killing MC. She was really close with MC and still wore a friendship ring that he had given her years earlier. Even though I usually wouldn't have allowed someone to verbally bash another C in my presence, I let her speak her mind and vent everything about these two brothers that she needed to say. She told me how they were running around Salinas acting like they were high-powered shot callers and how their actions discouraged and pushed a lot of people away from the NF. She also felt like they were behind the green lights that had been put on her and her sister Lisa. Later on, I would find out that her sister Lisa had actually cooperated with the police in the investigation on Hector Copas Gallegos, but the truth was Sophie did not. I personally read and screened all the paperwork over the course of 3 weeks while I was out, and Sophie was the only one who held her mud. It's an embarrassment and completely mortifying that a green light can be placed on the blood family of a fellow C's sister for assuming that she was talking when in fact she wasn't. But that's what happened, and that's how heartless the organization can be. When I told her that Mateo had also tried to put me in touch with another homeboy named Bobby, she said she'd introduce me to him later, but that him and his wife Monica both worked. Monica was actually her cousin, so she was real close with Bobby. After we finished talking, she dropped me back off at the hotel and said she'd call me later, and then she left. As soon as she was gone, I called Wino and asked when he was coming by. Wino said he was just getting off work and would shoot by and pick me up. He said he wanted to introduce me to a couple homeboys who were functioning in the regiment and bring me up to speed with all the street issues and everything they were involved in. When Wino finally pulled up, he was with two homeboys, one from Little Casitas who they called Animal, and Gabe, G Money Caracheo, who came out to Ukiah with Chico a few months earlier. There was also another carload of homeboys behind us who followed us to a house somewhere on the south side of Salinas. At first, I felt a little awkward and apprehensive based on the fact that it was so out of the ordinary for them to parole me to Salinas. I thought that maybe these brothers might have thought that I was a plant or an informant working with the feds, especially in light of everything that was going on at that time. For an NF member of my status to be paroled there from another county was really uncommon. I thought that this might have raised red flags or caused suspicion. Honestly, I was just as uncomfortable being out there myself, but I assumed it was just to set me up and get me caught up in all the drama that was taking place at that time. A homeboy who they called Cornut from Little Casitas lived at the house we went to with his girlfriend and their kids. All these little youngsters from Casitas were Bubba's boys, and he had essentially groomed them all. While we were there, we spent the next hour drinking and talking about the regiment. Wino told me that both Bubba and Smokey were back in on short violations and they'd both be out in a couple months. As we began to delve off into all the things the regiment was involved in, the biggest and most pressing objective seemed to be gaining the faith and the confidence back that was lost after Smiley and Lobo's run was over. Salinas has always been one of Northern California's strongest areas when it came to the NF's influence or presence on the streets. But the damage that Smiley and Lobo caused had become deeply rooted, even amongst some of the most loyal and committed sympathizers. MC was not only a legend in Salinas, he was a father figure to some of the younger gang members. He was a friend, he was an inspiration, and he was someone a lot of people looked up to. Chinatown was also another topic we discussed. Because this area has a heavy concentration of drug activity, the NF has always tried to control it and establish it as its own. There were other street-level dealers out there and a lot of Mexican nationals who were freelancing and selling retail amounts of drugs. But our objective was to tax these dealers and force them to pay distribution rights. Later on, Wino drove me back to my hotel. Before he left, he gave me $300 and told me that this was to help me out with whatever I needed. Animal and Gabe handed me another $200 each and left. This was customary for C's or brothers who were just paroling and needed help with living expenses and getting on their feet. About an hour after I got back to my room, Sophie called and asked if I wanted to go out with her and her homegirl Melissa later that night. Although I had never met Melissa, Bubba showed me pictures of her when we were in Quentin, and I knew she was a little cutie pie. I wasn't doing nothing, so we made plans for her to come by and pick me up in a few hours. When they pulled up in front of the hotel, they were in Melissa's Camry and Melissa was driving. We ended up going to Applebee's for dinner and then drove to Sophie's house where I spent the night. After it got real late, Sophie went upstairs and crashed out, leaving me and Melissa alone downstairs in the living room. I told Melissa I crashed on the floor and she could take the couch, but she insisted that I lay down on the couch as she grabbed a blanket. When she came back with the blanket, she crawled over me and laid down on the couch next to me. This girl was torturing me and knew exactly what she was doing. But as attractive as she was and as bad as I wanted to be with her, I held back only because I remember Bubba saying he was with her and I knew she was writing them while we were still in Quentin. I was fresh out of prison, Melissa was bad, and this took every bit of discipline and self-control that I could muster. I wholeheartedly regretted it for a long time, but Bubba was my boy and I didn't want to cross that line. When we woke up early the next morning, Melissa bounced to work and I jumped in the shower. Sophie came downstairs and told me that she called Bobby and he was on his way over with his wife. She said he was going to fire up the barbecue pit in the backyard and hook up some carne asada. Later I would find out that they actually called him Barbecue Bob because he was always barbecuing. Bobby was apparently real close to Sophie's brother Mateo, and Sophie said they were best friends growing up together. She said he used to be a heavy drinker and at one time was using a lot of drugs, but after he met his wife and they had kids, he stopped doing everything and had basically gotten his life together. Although Bobby didn't drink, use drugs, or run around in the streets with the fellas, his heart was still with the homeboys and he tried helping out wherever he could. He was the type of homeboy you could swoop up and take to go handle whatever needed to be handled, but he had his shit together so much that you wouldn't want to put him in that position. He always kept his doors open to the seas, and most of the time we would use his backyard to hold meetings or talk about regimental business. If we went over there on a weekend and stayed for more than a couple hours, Bobby would usually be barbecuing on the other side of the yard, listening to oldies. When Bobby and Monica finally got there later that afternoon, Bobby treated me like I was an extension of Mateo. He knew I had just left him in the bay, and it was through our mutual friendship with Mateo that Bobby and I eventually got real close. We ended up spending the rest of the day barbecuing and talking about some of the things Bobby and Mateo did while they were growing up together. At one point, when we were all outside in the backyard, Bobby got a phone call from his niece, who told him that her boyfriend had just beat her up and was refusing to give her some of her shit back. Apparently, he had them in the trunk of his car at his job and wouldn't give her the keys to retrieve her stuff. Bobby said he was going to drive over there to confront the dude, and I went with him. We drove to his niece's house, picked her up, and drove to this guy's work. As we were driving over there, I just sat in the back seat and listened to his niece as she told Bobby how this guy beat her up and wouldn't give her the baby's clothes back. She said she was leaving him and that he was all butthurt about it. When we pulled up to his work, he was standing outside talking to another guy who I later found out was his boss. When we got out of the car, I let Bobby do all the talking at first, as I wanted to get an idea of how he wanted to handle it. I just posted up. Bobby told him, "Pop your trunk and let my niece get her shit. Otherwise, I'm going to take your keys and get it myself." This guy didn't even say nothing. He knew he was wrong, so he just walked over to his car, popped his trunk, and let her grab her stuff. As she was loading everything into Bobby's trunk, Bobby told the guy, "I'll deal with you another time, but if you ever lay another hand on my niece, I'm going to fuck you up." That was my cue. That was what I was waiting for. As soon as I heard this, I socked the guy and knocked him out. I hit him one time in the jaw and that was it. As soon as I laid him out, his boss said he was calling the cops. Yeah, I know you guys just think I'm lying again. Here I go, Boxer the Terminator, knocking everybody out. It is what it is. We jumped back into Bobby's car and left. Once we were gone and started driving away, I started to feel like I might have jumped the gun and should not have done what I did. There was a long, awkward silence where nobody said a thing. This wasn't something we talked about beforehand. Bobby's niece finally broke the silence by thanking me for helping her, but then she started crying. Seeing him get knocked out obviously upset her, but as far as I was concerned, this fool had it coming. Bobby thought it was funny, and that's all he kept talking about the rest of the night. He couldn't wait to get back to tell Monica and Sophie either. After we dropped his niece off, we drove to a liquor store to buy more beer and then drove back to Sophie's. When we got there, her dad ended up showing up and was in the living room sitting on the couch. He introduced himself, and just like everyone else that found out that I had just left Mateo, he asked me a lot of questions about Mateo and what it was like there. Her dad was an older guy they called Silver Fox, who still ran with the homeboys and was still out there in the mix. He didn't function within the regiment, but scored dope from us and was always there to assist if needed. Eventually, Bobby and Monica left later that night. Bobby gave me his number and said to call whenever I wasn't busy. He had a room at his house that he converted into a weight room and said that if I ever wanted to work out with him, to call and he'd pick me up after work. Later that night, Sophie took me upstairs to her room and showed me a website that had hundreds of articles and stories about the Black Widow investigation. As she was flipping through the articles, she came across one that literally took my breath away. It was a small article out of the Santa Rosa Press-Democrat about 3 high-ranking NF members holding a meeting in Ukiah, California. It didn't give any names, but as soon as I saw it, I knew without a doubt that it had to be the meeting I had with Big Roach and Eminem. I knew for a fact that there were no other NF members in Ukiah. After having lived in that small community for a little over a year, I knew almost everybody out there and definitely would have found out about any other C's who might have been staying out there. After reading numerous articles for several hours, Sophie said she was going to lay down and would show me more websites, articles, and pictures in the morning. They literally had the whole Black Widow case on the internet. From transcripts to actual crime scene pictures of MC's murder. This case was generating a massive amount of publicity, and the news coverage extended all the way down to Southern California. The History Channel even televised a documentary about the case on a series called Gangland that showcases different street and prison gangs across the nation. I would later watch the episode where Lizard actually did a censored interview on it with his face blurred out, using the fictitious name Casper. After Sophie had lain down, I turned off the computer and told her I'd see her in the morning. When I started to walk out, she asked me where I was going. I said downstairs to crash out on the couch. She said her dad was probably there, adding, "Go ahead, you can lay down on the bed. I don't bite. Just don't go all the way under the covers." As soon as I lay down next to her, Sophie turned over and faced me. Sophie was Mateo's sister. She was a pretty girl too. I don't think Mateo was too concerned about what she did in her personal life, as she had been with a lot of C's before in the past, and Mateo never said a word about it. But even then, this was his sister, and for me, it kind of felt a little awkward. As she laid there looking at me, she asked if I thought she was pretty. The question surprised me, so I jokingly tilted my head from side to side, as if weighing it out, and I said, You're alright. She asked if I wanted to kiss her. I said, maybe. Sophie said, then why don't you? I ended up sleeping with her that night, and from that night on, we became involved in a relationship. As soon as I got out of bed the next morning, Wino stopped by and walked in through an unlocked front door. Her dad had left to go to work earlier, and I had literally just rolled out of bed with her. Apparently, this was a little obvious to Wino, because the first thing he did was pull me aside and said, "Hey, you know she's with the C stalker, right?" This was Martin Ramirez, who had just gotten indicted in the Cap Saloon murder. I looked back at Wino, shaking my head, and said, "Nah, bro, she didn't tell me shit about Stalker." Wino said, "Don't trip. That ain't your fault. But the brother's under the impression that they're still together, so you might want to be careful with that." He didn't say nothing to Sophie during the few minutes he was there, but as soon as he left, I confronted her about it. I asked her why she didn't tell me that she was already involved with Stalker, and if she understood the bad position she put me in. I told her, "I can get whacked for this shit. Woman, are you crazy?" Sophie denied that she was ever in a relationship with Stalker, offering that she was seeing him when he was out there, but they were never in a committed relationship. I told her that I really didn't care what she thought, and that what mattered was what he thought. I also told her that she needed to make this clear to him if he was under any other impression. She told me she'd take care of it when he called her later that night, but that she didn't think she should have to tell him shit because he knew they weren't together and that they were both doing their own thing when he was out there. I told her I needed to make sure it was addressed because something like this could end up getting me death sentence. Later on that evening, I had Sophie drive me by the hotel to grab some of my clothes and a few other things I needed. As soon as we walked in the room, the first thing I noticed was that somebody had taken all the beer bottles and cans out of my garbage and lined them up on top of one of my nightstands. It looked like somebody had also flipped through my parole box and searched the whole room. When I walked around the side of the bed, I noticed that there was a parole card sitting on my bed from Supervisor Bordoff that read, "Come by the office early Monday morning." He couldn't make an issue out of the beer bottles because I didn't have a 5B, a no alcohol clause, and I hadn't done nothing since I'd been out, but socked that one fool. But for some reason, I had a bad feeling about this. I thought it was pretty funny that he dug in my trash can and took the time out to line up all my empty bottles and beer cans though. The following morning, Sophie drove me to the parole office and parked down the street. I didn't think I could really get in trouble for being in the car with her since she wasn't considered a validated gang member. But just based on the case she was involved in, I didn't want to take any chances. When I walked in the parole office, I signed in and waited for Bordoff to buzz me in. A few minutes later, he opened the door and called me in. As I was walking through the door leading into the back office area, I saw him in my peripheral waving his arm above his head to another parole officer down the hall. He thought I had my back turned and didn't see him, but I caught the whole thing. He was motioning to this other agent as if to say, "This is the one right here." When I walked into Bordoff's office and sat down, a swarm of parole agents rushed up to the door and blocked the doorway. Bordoff pulled out his handcuffs and told me to get up and turn around. After he put me in handcuffs, he said, "Where you been? I've been in your room twice in the last 2 days and you haven't been in there at all. I know you've been in San Francisco, so you're going back." I said, "San Francisco? I haven't left Monterey County since I've been here. I met a female at a bar off of Alisal and I ended up spending the last 2 nights with her. Where does it say in my parole conditions that I'm not allowed to do that?" I told him, Borda, like I said, I haven't left Salinas since I've been here, and that's the truth. He asked me where this female lived, but I told him, I barely know my way around to the liquor store in front of my hotel. Even if I did know where she lived, I wouldn't be able to tell you how to get there. He couldn't prove that I had been to San Francisco like he thought, and I honestly think he believed me. He decided not to violate me that day, but the new halfway house in the marina had opened up that day, and he told me that's where I was going to be staying now. Up until now, my assigned agent, Tim Work, had been on vacation, but he was now back. Tim told me that I needed to go back to my hotel room and get all my stuff so we could drive out to his place in the marina and give me a bed. He offered to drive me, but I told him I'd walk and would be back in an hour. When I got outside and back to Sophie's truck, I told her what happened and then I needed to get back to the hotel to get my stuff so I could take care of this. After I returned to the parole office, Tim drove me to this new place in the marina and introduced me to the guy who managed the house. He was a black guy at a seaside who was an ex-parolee himself. This house was brand new and in a nice neighborhood. It was almost too nice to have a house full of parolees living there. It was a 4-bedroom house and I was the second guy to move in. After Tim left, I sat down and talked to this black guy trying to fill him out. This fool was super cool and ended up being on board with everything I ran by him. So this ended up being not so bad. He told me I could basically do as I pleased. He had my back to the fullest as long as I gave him a heads up with what I was doing. His whole thing was not to get caught off guard if parole came by, because then it would look like he wasn't doing his job. He told me that it was on me whether or not I was going to follow the 10 o'clock curfew, but that he'd never say anything unless they showed up and I was out. I was basically free to do whatever I wanted, and that's how it was the whole time I stayed there. For the next couple of weeks, I stayed at the halfway house and came and went at will. Parole never came by and checked on me. If I didn't spend the night at Sophie's, she'd spend the night with me at the marina. As far as I can remember, I was the only one out of the other 4 guys who ever brought a woman over there. After making several more attempts at trying to get my clothes and things from Melissa and Ukiah, I finally gave up on her. She lost all the cars and it was obvious that she was playing games, so I never called her back or ever heard from her again. Honestly, I wasn't too concerned about her. I had gotten really close to her kids, and that was the only thing that really bothered me. During this time, the regiment out in Salinas was still unestablished and wasn't really generating a lot of money. I personally didn't have any clientele at the time and wasn't about to hit the streets in Chinatown or the tracks to start dealing on the street level. The only 3 brothers making any money out there were Jacinto Shorty Duelas, Gabe G Money Caracheo, and Animal. Everybody else was working legitimate jobs and only contributed the minimum $200 monthly. Because I knew Gabe since he drove out to Ukiah with Chico, I started kicking it with him and tried to establish resources through him. He had his own house that his father left him right off the freeway in Prunedale. If I wasn't with Sophie, I'd usually be with Gabe. At the time, Gabe and I were both worried about getting caught up in the Black Widow investigation, and we frequently talked about it. He was worried due to his suspected involvement in a gang-related homicide, and I had my concerns due to my extensive street involvement over the years and all the C's I'd been involved with. A lot of them got caught up, and some were now cooperating. Big Roach ended up getting indicted on racketeering charges, along with 7 other C's on June 18, 2001. He had since begun cooperating, and this had me concerned. In fact, he was on the same indictment with Chico. Those indicted were Joseph Pinky Hernandez, Robert Chico Rose, Israel Silent Mendoza, Ramiro Goose Garcia, Albert Bird Lares, Armando Suave Heredia, Anthony Chino Morales, and Louis Big Roach Oroche. Meanwhile, I had high expectations of getting back in touch with Eminem, but within the first couple weeks after I paroled, I got word that he'd been killed in the middle of East Oakland. From what I'd been able to gather, he was killed by other rival black gang dealers who were competing for clientele. Bottom line, Eminem was killing the market and making too much money, so they eliminated the competition by taking him out. According to what I was told, he was at a stoplight in broad daylight with his 8-year-old son and his cousin when someone walked up to his car and shot him with a high-powered assault rifle. His son and cousin weren't hit and survived the attack, but Eminem died before his cousin could get him to the hospital. Sometime toward the latter part of 2001, Sophie and I were at Gabe's house when 2 homeboys, Chris Chino Clip and William Flacco Vic from the San Jose Regiment, showed up with their old ladies. This was the first time I met either one of them. Their whole purpose for stopping by was to buy some dope and do business with Gabe. They had their own resources in San Jose, but every now and then when it got dry out there, they go through Gabe. Prior to them coming out, Gabe said that Chino slung ink, tattooed, so I told him to have Chino bring his gun with him. While they were there, he blasted the Golden Gate Bridge across the front of my neck and filled in the Nuestra Familia-Letters on the back of my head. Before Chino and Flaco left that night, we exchanged numbers and made plans to hook up sometime within the next couple of weeks. The following day, Sophie and I picked up Gabe in the early morning and gave him a ride to the courthouse. Afterwards, we were on our way back to her place when we came to a stoplight somewhere on the west side of Salinas. As we sat there, I noticed a black and white Salinas PD cruiser pull up to the light in the intersection on our left and stop. As soon as Sophie made the left turn, I knew we'd get stopped because she didn't hit her blinker and this fool was watching us. I thought about jumping out and trying to get out of the car before he made his turn, but he was already on us and I didn't have time. Since I was on parole, he searched the whole car and ran us both for warrants. We were probably there for about 20 minutes waiting for him to finish searching and running our names when someone unobtrusively walked up behind me and tapped me on the shoulder. When I turned around, my parole officer Tim Work was standing there with a pair of handcuffs in his hand. He looked at me and said, "We got a major problem, so right now I need you to put your hands behind your back and assume the position." I was under the impression that he was going to violate me just based on police contact alone. But he caught me completely off guard when he said, "It's real coincidental that out of all the women in Salinas, you just so happen to get pulled over in the car with Sophie Rocha." I said, "Why is that?" He said, "Come on, man. I've been knowing Sophie since she was a little girl, and it's not a coincidence that you're with her, and that she just so happens to be the sister of your fellow NF member, Mateo." I said, "So what? She's not a validated gang member." He said, "It doesn't matter. Besides that, you have fresh ink on the back of your head, so I gotta send you back." I'd forgotten all about the tattoo that Chino worked on the night before. And when Tim walked up behind me, he must have gotten a good look at it. There was nothing I could say about it either. Even though I already had the tattoo from years earlier, just the fact that I got it touched up and filled in was enough to justify violating me. And that's exactly what happened. Tim hit me with 2 violations, one for association with Sophie Rocha and the other for gang activity. I was barely out for 2 months. My time out there never seemed to last longer than a few short months. Tim had the cop who pulled us over transport me to the county jail. Once again, I was on my way back. I had never been to the Monterey County Jail. I wasn't really sure what to expect or what would happen once I got there either. But I wasn't looking forward to it. Over the years, I heard a lot of stories about the jail from different homeboys from Salinas, but this was still unfamiliar territory for me. I did remember that all the NF and NR members were usually housed in C-Pod, and this is where I would try to make my way to. I knew that Bubba, Boxer, Suave, T-Zolt, Stalker, and a few other homeboys were all there, as I had just spoken to Bubba on the phone a few days earlier. As my luck would have it, they wouldn't house me back there with them. When I got there, the gang intel officers told me that they were going to put me in an observation cell by myself because they didn't know anything about me, and parole indicated that I was high profile. Further, due to the split amongst the NF members in Salinas at the time, they were unaware if I was aligned with Copas or Smiley. I didn't respond either way. I tried to make a case to get back to C-Pod and said I knew everybody there, but they still refused to house me with them. They said I'd be there for a couple days either way, and were making special arrangements to get me on the first thing smoking. They didn't want me in their jail. The following morning, a deputy came by my door and handed me a bag full of cosmetics and miscellaneous canteen items. He said, "This is from your boys back there in C-Pod. They all send their love and want you to know that they've been trying to get you moved over there." The observation cell they had me in was all bad. I had no reading material, my neighbors were both J-Cats, mentally unstable, and they covered my door window with a thick piece of nylon material secured with Velcro patches. I spent most of my time working out and thinking about all the things I'd done since I've been in Salinas. The homeboys were unsuccessful at getting me moved, but a few days later, I was put on a bus and transferred to Santa Rita County Jail. Santa Rita was another county jail I'd never been to before. This was where some counties started sending their parole violators to. Santa Rita was a pit stop, or the main hub, where you go before putting you on a bus to San Quentin. When I got to Santa Rita, the gang intel officers in intake were making a big issue out of the NF tattoo on the back of my head and almost locked me up because of it. But I ended up convincing them that I wasn't there to start any drama and was just passing through on a short violation. I said, look, I'm only here on a violation. I'm not going to cause any problems. If you let me go back there with the rest of the GP general population, you won't hear nothing else about me. I really didn't think they'd actually let me go out there, but they did. While there, I called Wormy from time to time just to see how he was doing and how things were going. I had plans to eventually move back to Ukiah once I got off parole and wanted to keep touching base with him and make sure he was still out there. During one of these phone calls, Vicky answered and asked for my CDC number so Wormy could write. Without thinking too much about it, I gave her my info and asked Vicky if she could mail my letters back and forth to Conejo for me. I was no longer in touch with Melissa, and this communication was vital. I think I stayed in the county for about 3 weeks before they put me back on a bus and transferred me back to San Quentin. When I got to Quentin this time, I was housed back in C-section on the 5th tier. Bubba from Salinas and my homeboy Jesus Chewy Guerrero from San Francisco were the only 2 C's there at the time. Chewy was the one with me when I met Connie that day in La Raza Park back in 1992. It had been almost 10 years since I last saw him. He had picked up a manslaughter for stomping out a grocery store security guard and had done almost a 10-year bid in the Bay. Coincidentally, he spent most of that time in C5 with Conejo and had been pulled sometime in the mid-90s. After going through all the new arrival formalities of filing my report and getting cleared, I eventually took over the RC position again. During the few months I was there waiting to get transferred out, I spent my time educating some of the younger Norteños on the yard and scouting out potential manpower that had a desire to function on the streets. There were a lot of good homeboys that had passed through there at the time, and I was hurting for manpower. NR member Hank Spanky Navarez from Santa Rosa, NR member Jason Listo Bachmeyer from Santa Rosa, NR member Stephen Littleman Doobie from San Francisco, and NR member Pete Rascal Zamora from San Francisco were just a few who were there with me. The first tier was still overflowing with DOs, dropouts, and the sad part about it was that I knew every damn one of them. At one point or another, I had done time with them over the years, and it was actually disappointing to see them down there. Not because they were dropouts, but more so because I had been close to them, and we were now on 2 different sides of the battlefield. Robert Angel Rodriguez from Daly City, Steve Beanie Steve Fernando from San Francisco, Charles Tuna Hill from Hayward, Gerald Oso Winston from Santa Rosa, Daryl Weddle D. Cost from Hayward, Anthony Chavo Jacobs from Hayward, and Luis Lucho Montalvo from Hayward were just a few to name. A lot of the homeboys who had fallen wayside were solid dudes at one time or another, but were now conducting themselves like straight idiots. Some of these individuals spent the majority of their time talking shit on the wire and airing out their demons that plagued them. Instead of sticking to themselves and doing their own thing, they yell out their doors all day, making a mockery of the homeboys who were still active in their cells above them. They would literally spend their entire days consumed with preaching the gospel against the cause. Every one of them was bitter. Everyone had a story, and every one of them despised anyone who was active in pushing the NF's agenda forward. It literally ate some of them up inside, having to accept the fact that they had been banished from the movement and were now considered trash, derelicts, and degenerates. All their hostilities were now being leveled against those who were still part of the collective. It was almost as if silence haunted them and forced them to look deep within themselves and where they were at. They had to make noise and continuously hear themselves talk. It took a lot of discipline not to engage in trash talking with them. I always enforced stringent policies forbidding any of the homeboys from ever saying anything back to any one of those dudes. Whenever someone got called out of the unit for medical visits or the law library, they'd have to walk down to the 1st tier, past all these cells, and listen to all the bullshits these fools would woof. To be honest, some of the shit they'd say was so far out that I'd actually have to stop myself from laughing. Some of these fools had vicious mouthpieces and would come up with some comical shit, but I never personally became a target of their rancor. Even though I despised them, they would talk to me whenever I walked by, and I always acknowledged them. Just affording them that meager ray of respect was enough to keep them pacified and keep their indignation deflected away from me. Shortly after my arrival and clearance, I found out that Mark Caja Rodriguez from San Jose also laid down, dropped out about a week before I got there. Apparently, he gathered as many kites and as much sensitive information as he could while he was there, and then locked it up. This didn't surprise me at all, but I never got a chance to see him because he was housed somewhere on the first tier in East Block. Over the next couple of months, a few more C's would end up passing through at one time or another. Jermaine Gonzo Gonzalez from Livermore, Javier Pelon Martinez from Watsonville, Jaime Smokey Rodriguez from Salinas, and Lorenzo Lencho Guzman from San Jose all passed through. Gonzo had been pulled by Bobby Silent Lopez from San Jose when he was in the adjustment center with them. He was another brother whom I took a real liking to. On the other hand, Smokey was my boy, and I was just glad that we had the opportunity to meet back up again. I told him how I found his house on the corner of Sanborn and East Market the first day I paroled to Salinas, and knew it was his house from the finger painting in the concrete walkway. Smokey was back in on a violation and was due to be released about a month before me. So unless he came right back, I knew we'd definitely catch up with each other this time. My homeboy Chewy from Frisco was set to get out 2 weeks before Smokey, so we were all going to be stepping out around the same time. Lencho drove up a couple weeks later and was supposed to get out a week after me. Once again, we all made plans to link up and combine our resources on the streets. In the early 90s, when the regiments were called colonias, Spanish for colonies, we were strongly forbidden from working with other street regiments from other cities. But by this time, nobody seemed to care anymore. I networked every time I got out there. I never limited myself. If I could tap into other resources and utilize this to my advantage, then I did it and made it work for me. The reason working together was strictly forbidden was to prevent web investigations from taking down several regiments at the same time. If one regiment was subjected to law enforcement scrutiny and they were working with another regiment, it would inevitably carry over and have the potential to take down both regiments. But all the generals were worried about now was generating money and fattening up their bank accounts before they got commuted. Circumspect about the importance of security had been lost in the fold and didn't seem to be at the top of their list of priorities any longer. During the entire time Lencho was there with us, he was kept on walk alone. Apparently, this was behind information that Lizard divulged to the feds about Lencho being placed on freeze by NF Captain Jimmy Wino Siriolski. According to what Lizard told the feds, Wino put Lencho on freeze for running his mouth, for smoking KJ, and for not following his directives. I didn't get all the details about exactly what happened and honestly didn't care. It wasn't my business, it was Lencho's problem. During the entire time I was there with them, all Lencho did was foam at the mouth about why it was wrong and why he was being mistreated. At one point, Lencho got a message from his old lady Peggy indicating that someone with the last name of a flower had locked it up in Santa Rita and was cooperating with the FBI. She said that this individual was a C who was just recently indicted in the Black Widow investigation. That was the extent of her message. Right away, Lencho assumed that it had to be Robert Chico Rose from Salinas. Without concrete confirmation, Lencho began assassinating his brother's character over the tier. I got upset about it and told him to quit speaking on the brother until we got solid information on who they were talking about. But Lencho insisted that it had to be Chico. The message was supposed to be coming from Skip, but it was still being passed through Peggy. Based on what was relayed in the filter, I even thought that it was probably Chico, and it actually turned out to be him, but that wasn't the point. Chico was a C and deserved the benefit of the doubt until we found out one way or the other. I told Lencho, I'm not going to filter that out, and neither are you. I got so upset about it that we actually stopped talking to each other for a couple days. Chico was my boy, but I would have spoke up for any C that was in the same position, including Lencho. The other thing that bothered me was that Peggy was the type of woman who assumed she had special powers based solely on the fact that she was communicating with Corny and Skip. Because of this close association, she acted like she was vested with some type of exempt authority, that she could do and act as she pleased. Peggy became so involved in our internal business that she thought she could actually start barking orders at some of the C's. My involvement with Peggy would become much more extensive in time, but women like Peggy were the worst layers that the organization harbored. Lencho eventually conceded and admitted that he was wrong. But by this time, it didn't even matter, because a week later, Skip sent official confirmation that Chico had in fact defected. Sometime in mid-2002, I was put on a bus and transferred to Corcoran.